Hey everybody, it's James P. Wagner here. I'm here with Nick.
Hey James, hey everybody.
Yep. And we're the publishers for Local Gems Press, and this is the Publishers Speakeasy, the Don't Tell Anybody, where we answer questions that people have sent in to us about publishing and poetry and things like that, because we tend to have the same conversations over and over and decided to make these videos so we don't have to, but we know we will anyway. Um, so this question that somebody came in today was one that kind of made me laugh a little bit because I think all poets have made this joke at some point or another. But that the question is basically, do people even read poetry anymore? Uh, Yeah, I know. I know that we tend to joke about how some poetry readings, in the past it was like, thank you both for showing up and things like that. Even though in the last 10 or 15 years, obviously attendance at live events had kind of been, kind of going up and up and up and up and up. And then, well, then COVID happened and that kind of put a little damper in at least the live in-person event. But then you had Zoom events and, people were attending that. And now you kind of have like this, 50-50 thing going on between virtual events and that. But then again, I guess attendance is different than the actual readership. But if I'm going to put just a short answer on that, yes, people still still read poetry. That would be the short answer. In fact, I would actually say that studies and statistics show that people actually read poetry a lot more than they even used to, like 10 or 20 years ago. It's kind of just the mechanisms of how they read it have kind of changed because are people like necessarily going out and buying like full length poetry collections to read? Not necessarily, even though the number of that has actually gone up as well. But these days, thanks to the internet and blogs and websites and Instagram and things like that, it's really not hard for people to share poetry, especially short poetry. And in the age that we're kind of having, where attention spans have been kind of going down, also. Sometimes the short form of poetry has actually been something people have enjoyed reading because it doesn't take a lot of time to actually read it, but then they can actually get a lot out of it. And then there's also the fact that people might be reading poetry, but it might not be referred to as poetry. It might be like, inspirational quotes or inspirational messages or something like that. I mean, you think about like all, Hallmark cards, how much poetry is in that. You don't call it poetry, but so yeah, obviously people are still reading poetry.
There you go, taking my answer. Oh, that's okay because I have another one, and that is it. I think yes. My answer is also yes. And it's not just in school where they have no choice. Um, like you said, greeting cards, advertising slogans, um, many song lyrics can be considered poetry. And there's also a large group of people who love to post online and they like to post poetry. And uh, now, like, regardless of how you feel, there are a lot of people who feel very passionately about things, who like to write poetry about the things they feel passionately about and then post it online. And, so your social media is filled with poetry. And most of it is intentional poetry in this case. This isn't like the Hallmark, like people look at it every day. I'm not saying that like your Uncle Bob's political rant on Facebook is poetry. I mean, people actually intentionally write poetry and they put it on their social medias all the time. And then amazingly, people read it and then they hit that little thumbs up button. And that's how you know they read it.
Yeah, it's also not uncommon these days in a lot of cases, especially with blogs or news posts or things like that. That you see more and more somebody actually taking a poem and actually kind of putting it in the post or along with that, kind of like to almost emphasize the point that they were even making there or whatever. And you got people still they quote poetry all the time, to make their point. Like maybe not the complete poem, but pretty often people will take like a quote from a famous poet, say Basho, or Robert Burns or something like that. And, if they're, writing something that's prosy, they'll quote poetry with that to kind of go along with that. So, poetry has a habit of kind of sneaking into a lot of things. Again, that maybe it's not necessarily, you're going there for poetry, but it kind of worms its way in many ways. Because poetry is really like it's a carte blanche, is what I say to a lot of people, because it's it's kind of like water. It takes all these different forms. It can be about different subjects. It can be about different themes. It could be using different tools to get it out there. Like you said, with song lyrics and things like that. So just there's infinite other ways that poetry is being read in this day and age. Because another interesting just statistic in general is that people are reading more. Despite popular belief and despite what people think about attention spans, which is true, because we're bombarded with so much stuff now, videos, audio, this or that. But people actually do read more today than they did 20 years ago. It's just usually it's in shorter bursts because again, emails, news articles online, blog posts, things like that. So people might not be reading. I mean, I know that in America, I think the statistic right now is that the average adult outside of school, reads 8 books a year, like full length books, and that's the average. So that means that most people are, because there's the people who are reading a whole lot more than that. So that means that, the average person literally is probably reading a whole lot less than that because that's what comes out in the middle.
Well,
But
yeah, that makes sense when you consider that like most people go through their entire day speaking and listening in text.
yeah.
So it just makes sense. It's just that the source is different than where people were reading, 100 years ago.
Mm-hmm. So in general, people are, reading, a lot more, just maybe not in, as thick bursts. Like we might not be sitting there for like, hours reading a book cover to cover. And the same thing even, with when it comes to poetry books itself, because statistically speaking, the sales of poetry books, I mean, well, there's a couple of things here. One, there's a lot more poetry books than maybe there were before. Because you go back like 100 years ago, publishing, was a little bit more of an enclosed situation. Not, I mean, first of all, literacy was, not as high as it was, and publishing was much more expensive and much more of a, a privilege to actually have books and things like that when you go, the farther back in time you go. But right now, thanks to the internet, tablets, typing programs on the computer, it's like there's so much more ease of access to actually write and to actually share your writing. And so not only is it being shared more just in general for free, but more books are being done of poetry than there really kind of ever have before. So, I mean, at least as far as we know in recorded human history, like who knows if maybe a million years ago there was a greater civilization and there was more going on there. But at least as far as what we know is recorded history as it is.
That's out of the scope of this question, I think.
Yeah, I think, yeah,
That's a
definitely.
whole other discussion.
Yeah, probably on a different TV show, but yeah, so there's more poetry books being done than ever before, and people, the sales are going up. So in both the literal sense, yes, people still read poetry and they're still buying poetry books and things like that. And in the sort of, almost cheating but not really sense, where it's like there's other ways that you're reading it, yes, people are reading it more there. So that, now I know that a lot of people ask that because there's a lot of poets out there who, they're like, oh, I'm writing poetry and I don't have a lot of readers. But that's a whole other conversation about basically how to get the stuff kind of out there and get it in front of people and attract readers. But just because that's like saying sort of, oh, is anybody buying paintings anymore? Just because somebody might be painting in their garage and nobody's buying it. It's like, yeah, they are.
Yeah,
It's
so
just,
I don't even I don't even agree with you that it's cheating. Some of these internet sources, because the places like Instagram or Pinterest or Tumblr where people are posting like a graphic with a poem on it, that's still, you're still reading poetry. Sure, you maybe you're not
oh
buying
yeah,
a book. But people have, I think, wider access to, just like everything else, right? Just like music. Say, do people even buy CDs anymore? Maybe not. They buy vinyl more than they buy CDs. But the
yeah,
point is, people have more access to free poetry. And I think also a lot of people are reading poetry, but they're not necessarily reading the same poetry. It's not like, 100 years ago where if you had, you know, you were reading T.S. Eliot, you were reading T.S. Eliot because that's what was in your magazine or in the
yeah.
book that you bought because that was what was available.
Yeah, well, that's actually like just a problem with entertainment media in general these days. Is actually in some ways, there's like the pros and cons of the diversification of it because, in the olden days, like maybe you had 10 channels on TV, but if you're watching shows on there, you're going to walk outside and pretty much everybody else is going to be watching those shows. So you're kind of like almost culturally intertwined by the fact that everybody's watching the same stuff and everybody was reading the same stuff in magazines and things like that. So now there's like there's more movie studios, there's more comic book publishers, there's more poetry publishers, there's more of everything. We can see that like things like with just Netflix and the shows that are available on that, which is it's good because there's more options, and it's like if maybe you like something that's like more specific, you can find that. But one of the caveats of that is that on the other hand, if you're watching a show, there might be a couple million other people watching that show, but like you go into like your local bar and want to talk about it, there could be like nobody else there who's ever heard of it or seen it. And so it's kind of like the same with like poetry books, or maybe or art or anything like that. It's like it might struggle a little bit more in the ethos to kind of find commonalities who maybe share this, the same readership or whatever. But but yeah, it doesn't mean that it's not happening in mass, because it definitely
Right.
is.
And there's something exciting about that too, though. The ability to, like, find something that nobody else, none of your friends has been able to experience before, that you enjoy, and then bring it to them and say, "Hey, check this out. That check out this poet that I just found. Check out this movie, this obscure movie that I just watched." So there is an upside to that as well. But yeah, it is kind of it's just different.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
pros and cons of everything. Whenever technology comes in and changes something, something changes, something new happens. Again, it's like maybe you like it more or less, but it's pretty much, new
Yeah.
options, so to speak. But
Get you
yeah,
into
and that's why, like, you
watching
have
much
like
half
those
of it.
examples of people, like, again, with Instagram, where they post like their poems with the images, and you had something like the Milk and Honey story that we talk a lot about, where it's like, that started from an Instagram page, where this person, they were posting poetry with images and all this stuff, and they had a really big following on there. So when they came out with the book, it was like instantaneous bestseller because it was such a big following like
Yeah.
that. But with social media like that, it is so easy to share that. I mean, I know somebody who does a little newsletter called Haiku du Jour, and basically they send out a haiku every day to, I mean, it's a relatively small email list in that case. I think it's a few hundred people, but an email, but then you got like, like Poets and Writers Magazine and things like that, where they actually, like, all these things where people, you can sign up for free. They'll, send out a poem a day to, hundreds of thousands of people who are ever on these things. So, uh, yeah, I mean, I guess there's only so many ways we could answer the question that yes, people still read poetry, but these are all the things that, the reasons why, which maybe not everybody's, kind of thinking, because, people probably, like, in a way, because technology has kind of developed so fast, our brains are almost kind of struggling to catch up on the new ways that things are actually shared. So when we're thinking like how many people are, well, that's kind of like why the New York Times bestseller list anymore is in a lot of ways obsolete, because the whole model of that is determined by, how many distributors are reporting this many copies sold, from this set of publishers to this thing. But there's like, there's people who sell books, like, you like self-published books on Amazon that'll sell like, hundreds of thousands or millions of copies that, New York Times doesn't even know about for like 7 years after it happened, so
Yeah, so it's like those writers markets that are also obsolete after what, a couple of months, because
yeah.
things are changing so much, and it's not like it's not this sort of exclusive industry anymore. You have so many people who are doing things and not necessarily reporting because they're not inside the industry, so to speak, who are outselling the main industry.
Yeah, exactly. So sometimes we're thinking with like, an outdated Windows operating system, and don't realize like, oh, there's all these new updates. And so sometimes we don't really judge that. But uh yeah, the fundamental answer is yes, people still read poetry, and poetry is still very popular. Some people like poetry, like we said, without even knowing it's poetry. And yeah, across the board, events are well attended, books are selling, and people are looking at it. So yeah, don't be discouraged that people don't read poetry. Somebody, I forget who said it first, but one quote about it is that poetry is the longest living dying art, because people have been saying like, oh, poetry is a dying art. They've been saying that for hundreds of years. I mean, just a little, this is a little bit of a side, but just to kind of prove the point, a lot of people don't know that the first thing that Benjamin Franklin ever published was a poem. It was a poem that he wrote about Blackbeard. When this was when he was like, 12, 13, he was apprenticed to his older brother James in Boston at the time at his print shop. And his brother James was okay with printing it up because it was basically street literature that he could just kind of sell or whatever. So, Benjamin wrote this poem about Blackbeard. They printed up, I forget what the number of copies was, probably 100 or two. He went around selling it for a little bit. People got it. It was entertaining. And then he was thinking, oh, maybe there's like a future in this. And then his father, Josiah, said, don't do that. There is no money in poetry. And this was in the 1700s, so and obviously Ben Franklin went on to do what he did. So maybe thank God he didn't focus on a career as a poet. But yeah, even back then people were saying that. So this many hundreds of years later, it's still here. And maybe it's like, one of those immortal creatures in a fantasy series, and maybe it's dying for like 10,000 years, something like that, because it's, you know people still read poetry. So hopefully we answered that question in many roundabout different ways. We'll see you next time on Publisher Speaks Easy. Look down below in the description here for free poetry prompts, and also talk about publishing coaching. And again, if you have a question, send it in to us because we love answering these questions. So take care, everybody, and we'll see you next time.
But